Next, I want to look at the way that you lay out your code when you put your JavaScript functions in a file. And the indentation matters. It doesn't matter to the JavaScript compiler. It matters to the human. When another developer or even you come back later and update your code, you're not going to go through and count the curly braces and say, am I inside this little if statement? Am I inside the else? You're going to look at the indentation. And code that has bad indentation is dramatically harder to understand and therefore dramatically harder to edit, therefore dramatically more expensive to your company to maintain. And it makes a huge difference. So it's almost a law. If you do not indent properly, I'll say what properly is shortly, the people on your team will say, you've written incorrect code. It's that important. There are some things that everyone agrees on and some things that people disagree about in indentation. But the things that people agree about are pretty simple. Whenever you have a curly brace, you should start indenting. Whenever you have the closed curly brace, you should stop indenting and put your code back at the indentation level that it had before. All right, everybody agrees about that. What they don't agree about is exactly where you should put the curly brace. There are people who think that for a loop and an if statement, you should put the curly brace on the same line, and other people think you should put it on the next line. And people don't agree, how many spaces should you indent? Should you indent 2 spaces, 4 spaces, or use tabs? My opinion is that they don't really matter. The important thing is you indent when you start a new block and you do it consistently. Whether you put the curly braces on the start line or the end line, I'll show you both versions in a couple of slides, doesn't really matter very much. The important thing is you indent. But indenting is critical. It seems like a minor thing. Well, I'm just kind of laying out my code. It'll run the same way as long as it gets the right answer. Who cares? Well, your company will care because it'll cost them more money to maintain your code if you don't do an indentation because people will have a hard time understanding your code. And if you submit a code sample or you are given a programming test and you don't indent, the people evaluating you will not hire you. This is considered an important part of JavaScript programming. So let me give some examples. Whenever you open a curly brace, you ought to indent. So I have a bunch of code and it's indented here. But then I have a curly brace. So the code inside the loop, inside the for statement, ought to be indented. And if I have a loop inside my first loop, a nested loop, and it has another curly brace, I should indent more. So the code on the left is considered correct. The code on the right is considered wrong, even though it'll execute the same way, because I open a curly brace, but I fail to indent. I open a curly brace, but I fail to indent. Okay, so everybody agrees. When you open a curly brace, in other words, you start a block, you should indent. Everybody also agrees that you should only change the indentation if you change the nesting level. So for example, these are all nested at the same level. They should be indented the same amount. These two statements are indented different amounts even though they're nested the same amount. This will confuse developers who come along later. These two are nested the same amount but indented differently, so the right is considered incorrect, the part on the left is considered correct. All right, those two things everyone agrees on. When you open a curly brace, indent, and conversely, don't change your indentation unless you've opened a curly brace, you've started a block. Most editors, Eclipse, NetBeans, editors from JetBrains, IntelliJ IDEA, Visual Studio from Microsoft, TextPad, TextEdit, UltraEdit, BBEdit, Brief, and so forth will do this indentation for you automatically. But check it just to make sure make sure when you open a block you indent, and that you indent consistently. Okay, those are things everyone agrees on. The part they don't agree on is exactly where you put the curly braces. Some people put the curly braces on the same line where they start either the for loop, the while loop, or the if statement. Other people put it on the following line. Okay, let's debate these 2 points. So the argument in favor of putting it on the following line is the open curly brace is lined up right on top of the closed curly brace. The open curly brace is lined up right on top of the closed curly brace. All right, that's a reasonable argument. They're lined up on top of each other. You can kind of scan and see which open curly brace corresponds to which closed curly brace. That's a reasonable argument. But the advocates of this approach also have a reasonable argument. And they say, nobody reads the curly braces anyway, they only look in the indentation. And furthermore, by putting the curly brace on the same line as the for or the while or the if, I make my code shorter so I can see more in the editor. I have more context. It's easier to understand. That's also a reasonable argument. And I think these arguments are about even. And so in practice, people tend to put the curly brace here more often than they put it here. But both are reasonable approaches and both are fine. In fact, I don't even think you need to have corporate or project coding standards. I don't think it's important enough that you need to dictate what the programmers do. I suppose you should be consistent within a file. But even from file to file, if some people put the curly braces on the same line and some people put them on separate lines, I don't think it really matters very much. I personally put the curly brace here. Partly because that's the way I first learned it, partly because I often put my code into PowerPoint slides, and PowerPoint slides aren't very tall, and so I don't want to push the code off the bottom. But I don't really have a strong opinion that my way is any better, or is at least particularly better, than that way. So do whichever style is natural to you. If your manager dictates a particular style of where to put the curly braces, now I personally think the manager doesn't need to, but if your manager does, don't waste your time arguing with him or her. It's not important enough. Save your arguments for something that really is important so you haven't used them up. The other thing that people don't agree on is how much to indent. Should I indent 2 spaces? Or should I indent 4 spaces? Or, 3 spaces, or 5 spaces, or 7 spaces, or tabs? The 3 most common approaches are 2 spaces, 4 spaces, or tabs. I like 2 spaces so that my code doesn't get pushed too far to the right and I can't see it anymore, but 4 spaces is also perfectly reasonable. Most editors and development environments let you set this. Okay, so indentation may seem like a minor thing, but it's not. Whenever you write JavaScript functions or later objects in a file, make sure you indent properly. And the definition of properly is whenever you open a curly brace, start indenting and keep that indentation consistent until you either open another curly brace where you indent farther, or you close a curly brace, in which case your indentation should go back to the level that it was before.